Hello everyone and welcome to What If Deku Had All for One. This is the first series I'll be doing on this channel. If you find yourself enjoying this series, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. With that out of the way, let's get right into it. Just about everyone could tell you exactly where they were that day. The exact time, what they were doing, how they felt, what the sky looked like from where they were standing. It's the nature of national disaster, something that so radically changes the face of a society and pushes history down a path it will never be able to turn back from. It is impossible to forget. For the little guy, for him and his family, they were far too close to the epicenter for comfort. At the time they had been going on a school picnic before the sky turned black, before all they could feel was raw, primal fear. But if you saw the battle that they did, survived what they did, you'd remember that day better than any other. Remembering bad things that happened to you is your mind's way of protecting itself, trying to keep itself from living through that trauma ever again. And if you're a kid, just a little, innocent child who'd never once seen the uglier sides of life, that staying power doubles, and the memories change you. Your nightmares revolve around them, your convictions shape around them, your resolve is tainted by them. They change you. When the memory begins, the first thing he remembers, whoever he recounts the story to, was sitting on the swings alone. Other children were running about and playing, using their quirks, superpowers inherited from birth, to have a rather energetic round of tag. The poor thing, alone on the swings, didn't have a quirk. He was a freak of nature, along with 20% of the population who was born like that. And the others knew. The others wouldn't let him forget. "Why does Bakugo always get to be the hero?" one child whined, crossing his arms. The short and fiery Katsuki Bakugo, his palms crackling with small explosions, just cackled. "Because if any of us is going to become the next All Might." He pointed toward a screen that loomed over the park, some distance away. At that exact moment, it was broadcasting an interview with the man Bakugo had just mentioned. "It's gonna be me." Sighing, the other boy just went quiet, but another one piped up in his place. "Why is he called the symbol of peace anyways?" Bakugo rolled his eyes. "Are you stupid or something? It's because he's so awesome that criminals are afraid to be bad, even when he's not around." Bakugo flashed a wicked grin, cackling under his breath. "Because of that, we don't have a bunch of stupid villains running around making the world a war zone. He's so strong he doesn't even have to throw a punch to keep evil in its place." Scratching the side of his head, that same boy gulped. "So, what do you think will happen if he dies?" Bakugo looked at him like his brain had just fallen out of his head. "Wouldn't more villains show up and make the world scarier?" At this, Bakugo just laughed hysterically. "Wow, you're even dumber than you look. Something like that will never happen, stupid. Fate can always be tempted. It finds it very hard to resist temptations like those." In that moment, as far as the child alone on the swings was concerned, Bakugo was absolutely right. All Might really was that powerful, and there was nothing that would ever change that. No villain or other force on Earth would ever be strong enough to kill or even hurt him. But that wasn't what was on his mind. Some distance away he watched as his mom and dad seemed to be arguing, quietly. They were avoiding making a scene, but nonetheless were not able to avoid airing their dirty laundry in public. Not that he knew, he was still too young to know that. To him, they just looked upset, perhaps at each other. His mother's face was quivering, trying not to let tears out, and his father wasn't even looking at her. Not that he could remember his father's face, even now. Looking back, he knew this was the end of their relationship. Everything had changed in so many ways after that day, and that was just one of them. It wasn't the thing that everyone would remember, though. That came now. The world erupted with explosions. A pair of bodies had crashed into each other, then hit the ground near the school so hard they left a crater in the road. Hurricane-force winds sent almost everyone flying as people ran screaming. The boy was thrown off the swing, and as he pulled himself up from the dirt, grabbing at the frame of the swing to steady himself, the bodies pulled themselves from the ground and started throwing punches at each other. This was no sloppy spur-of-the-moment brawl, this was something else, a rapid and calculated exchange of blows. Their fists struck each other with such ferocity and so regularly that the wind force created from the impacts shook the buildings around them, smashed the glass in windows. Civilians and children fled the scene as quickly as they could, leaving the little kid behind. Grasping onto the swing even tighter, the little guy's eyes went wide. All Might. The symbol of peace didn't hear him, and why would he? He was far too busy fighting for his life. A decisive strike sent the villain flying right past the kid, crashing through a building in a blast of rebar and fire, and All Might followed in a blur. From what the kid could see, the villain was dazed and All Might had his senses completely in hand. Taking advantage of this, All Might grabbed his enemy and started using him as a battering ram against the ruined building around them. Tossing him around like a rag doll, he threw the villain through girders and walls, as if trying to hit him with everything he could find. What terrified the boy in that moment was how oblivious All Might was to the devastation that he himself was causing. So focused was the symbol of peace on the fight before him that the office building they had crashed into toppled to the ground, rubble flying around them in a rain of devastation. All Might never lost track like this against villains. He was fighting like a wounded animal trapped in a corner, ferocious and scared and hell-bent on the outcome. Hurling his fist into his opponent's mask, he saw the translucent metal dent and crack. His attention flickered for a second and his punishment was a heavy smack to the head, from his enemy smashing a rock into his skull, blood flowing from the wound above his eye. In retaliation, All Might ripped a whole emergency stairwell from the rubble and slammed it into his enemy's head from above, crushing him down like one might crush rocks with a sledgehammer. As the dust settled it appeared he'd driven his opponent into the earth as though he were an oversized nail. For a few moments all seemed quiet. Ripping his way upwards, freeing himself from the earth, the villain uppercut All Might's chin. Sending him flying through some nearby wreckage, he saw his chance. Flying forward, fingers ready to deliver a lethal jab, he summoned one of his many quirks. Thrusting his hand forward his fingers stabbed straight into All Might's ribs. Reflexively, the hero recoiled from the injury, grabbing the wrist of his enemy. Spinning around mid-air he smashed the masked villain through the wreckage below them. Preparing to strike his opponent with another earth-shattering blow, All Might suddenly felt a searing pain. As his muscles contracted from the pain his hand clutched at his left ribs. Something was wrong. This injury wasn't a simple puncture. He crashed into the wreckage above his nemesis. All Might, shakily, rose to his knees. Pulling his shirt up he saw his very flesh rotting away. Spewing blood from his lips he suddenly realized what had happened. So you stole another dash. All Might was interrupted by a fist carving its way through the debris beneath him. As he was punched clean under the jaw he somersaulted back into the street. His injured ribs kept him off balance and he crumpled to the ground in a heap of muscle. The villain leapt into the road after him some 30 feet away, part of his mask obliterated by All Might's onslaught. Through the cracks in the mask, one glowing red eye shone with terrifying intensity. Blood, steaming on the metal, flowed from his wounded face. All Might saw the end result of his last victory against this man. His eyelid and the skin around his eye was gone, torn asunder by the punch that ended their last bout. As the hero's eyes widened and his smile vanished, he realized the reason behind this blind fury. His archenemy had decided the intensity of their rivalry had gone beyond. I told you, All Might. This is the end. No matter what, at least one of them was dying today. Groaning from the pain, All Might rose to his feet. He hated to admit it, but that looked to be the way this fight was headed. He could feel the effects of the newest quirk inside his body, his organs were rotting as he faced the personification of evil. And I told you, you will be stopped. Because I am here. Not this time. I will kill you today. You may try. His voice was weak, but if that's the case, he returned to his combat stance, ready to strike back or defend himself, then I'm afraid I can't hold back. Good, and his nemesis fell into his own combat stance, let this be our final battle, All Might. Put everything you have into it, because I. His eye narrowed, his bloodlust was unmistakable, will enjoy your demise. All Might's smile returned. And how many times have I heard that before? In the blink of an eye they were striking at each other again. Flying about in the air, devastating what remained of the buildings around them, they tore their knuckles into each other's flesh. Blasts of wind pressure, raging outward from them in all directions, sent rubble flying further into the city. Buildings were leveled, entire city blocks were reduced to shambling husks. It was like 3 tornadoes had hit this part of the sprawling metropolis simultaneously. From the frame of the swing, huddled to the ground and covering his head with the arm not clinging on for dear life to the swing frame, the child saw everything. Quivering, quaking, he just wanted this to end. All Might had to just win already. He had to beat the bad guy and make everything safe again. Unfortunately, it was beginning to become clear that All Might was losing. Taking a deep breath he formulated a desperate plan. This either ended in his victory or the entire world would suffer the consequences of his defeat. Landing on the ground, he stared right up at his enemy. He was soaring down like a homing missile, hand ready to jab at his already injured side. All Might merely smiled. He knew he was going to go for that. Forcing all of his power several times over into his right arm, his left hanging there like a broken wing, he braced himself. His enemy struck true, driving his hand clean through All Might's ribs. Blood spattered across the ground, pouring down All Might's side, as his organs and flesh rotted like rancid meat in the sun. The internal damage had been more than fatal. A sickeningly gleeful smile spread across the ruined face of the villain. He'd won. Or had he? Shattering those dreams in an instant, All Might retaliated as never before. United. He choked, blood spouting from his mouth, states of. His voice raised in volume, smash. Shouting at the volume of an erupting volcano he swung his fist into the air, bringing it down straight onto his nemesis's head. Unleashing the entirety of his quirk's collective power he blew a crater into the ground beneath them so deep that the sewer pipes beneath burst into an explosion of water amidst the fire. The force of the punch sent the air rocketing away and ignited it. Flames engulfed the area around them in a bubble. Then, as the laws of physics slowly realized what had happened, the air rebounded, collapsing back in on itself. A second shockwave was created. Emanating outwards, like the force of an atomic bomb, the remaining rubble was erased from the ruined city around them. The boy leapt to his feet, daring to step forward when the wind finally subsided. All Might, he screamed. As the dust settled, the child saw All Might lying inert upon the rubble. Charging forward, the little guy starting shaking his motionless form. Even as he desperately tried to wake him, screaming his name and begging him to wake up, reality had slowly started to sink in. The body he was touching, was growing colder by the second. All Might, was dead. A hand grabbed the child's shoulder, spinning the crying boy around. Eyes wide with terror, the boy saw a single, bloodied, glowing, red eye staring into his. The villain was alive, and he was touching him. He was going to die. The child opened his mouth to scream, only for the villain to jam his hand inside. Blood poured into the child's mouth, and he started screaming through his nose. That is, until the villain pinched his nose shut and waited. The kid couldn't breathe, he couldn't breathe. The villain's body was, trembling, the light in his eyes flickering. He was weak, possibly dying, but that didn't change the fact he couldn't breathe. His hands clawed at the villains, trying to make him let go, but he never did. "Doctor," the villain's voice was faint, barely even audible over the wheezing of his own breath. "Drink, and I let go." Never in his life would the little one forget the vile, slimy feeling of the fluid oozing down his gullet. The flavor, the horrid need to retch that followed, but he did as he was told. Even with so little of his face visible, the villain smiled as he collapsed. While the child gasped, his body heaving as he was finally able to breathe again, he wheezed out one word. "Name." The child, despite his trembling knees, despite his overwhelming fear, answered. "I, Izuku Midoriya." Still smiling despite his pain, the villain nodded. "Do you have a quirk?" Feeling like the smallest creature on earth, he shook his head. "No." Then, in an almost friendly way, the villain chuckled. "Well, it's your world now." As he gently spoke, Izuku felt his fear fading, watching the light fade from his eye. "Use your power well." Then his eye closed, and he went as still as All Might. He was dead too. Completely unsure what he'd meant, Izuku just stared at the lifeless body, completely at a loss for words. Then, on instinct, he started wandering away from the scene. Somewhere far away, he heard his mother screaming out his name, then his wandering turned to sprinting. His father was nowhere to be found, and would later be counted among the dead, but he had his mom. Amidst the spiraling chaos the world was about to become, in the years that followed, she'd be among the few good things she had. Sadly, she would claim the same about him, for the boy who questioned Bakugo was right. Without All Might, his powerful presence keeping villains scared, the world would soon see just how many people were willing to turn to crime to get what they so desired, and just how far heroes could fall. The world was headed into darkness now. But in that moment, crouched over the body of his fallen idol and choking back the bile that was coming from the taste of the villain's blood, 8-year-old Izuku Midoriya had no idea of the part he would play in the future of this world as it lay in darkness. In the future, they would remember this day. They would call it Incident Zero. "It's not going to happen, I'm afraid." Words that struck like hammers through glass, smashing his world to smithereens. When the doctor said he'd never be a hero, not without a quirk, all he could do was sit there and stare straight ahead. Days, weeks went right on by and he didn't say anything to anyone. He just remembered finding that clip, that one clip of All Might, the first clip. The rest was already a teary blur, all he remembered was asking his mother if he had a chance of ever being like All Might. All she could do was hold and weep, apologizing over and over. The day that followed All Might's death, he couldn't do much more than sit there and stare again. Cameras, teary-eyed reporters with lines on their faces from fear, so many voices all at once. All for the boy who was there. Right there. Questions he couldn't answer, anxieties he couldn't soothe, fears he couldn't assuage. All the while his mother sobbed, inconsolable at the disappearance of his father. Little Izuku just felt numb. Like his whole body had been motionless for far too long, circulation no longer flowing. Eventually, they just wandered home. Lines of houses, all with bright paint that hadn't chipped. Lush green trees, bushes and grass trimmed and hedged. Windows were clean and clear, cars polished and repaired. Roads were smooth and dark, the lines painted bright and fresh. So idyllic a place to go home to, and be miserable, so bold a contrast to the war zone in which he had been trapped. Phone calls came in the days that followed, one by one. The insincerity of the sympathy from some of his mother's friends made him choke back tears, almost as much as the call from his father's parents where they screamed their frustration and sadness to high heaven, blaming her for letting Daddy die. Izuku just hugged her, squeezing her tight. "It's okay, Mama, if All Might couldn't stop it, how could anyone?" The first reasonable or sensible thing anyone had said to her in almost a week, and it was from her own baby. Her response wasn't much more than picking him up and squeezing until both their arms hurt. Eventually, when she'd fallen asleep, Izuku let his numb and empty mind decide what he did next. A long walk, with no destination in mind. Little feet in little red shoes carried him along streets filled with mourners holding candlelit vigils. Children were crying at the death of the world's greatest hero and idol to all. Parents were holding each other as they stared fearfully at the odd future ahead. Maybe he wasn't so different, but they were trying to make themselves feel better. He wasn't. It wasn't easy to decide if that was a good or a bad thing, so he didn't try. Mental energy was in short supply right now, better to save it for things that really mattered. Hours passed, and his body wasn't in a place where it could tell how tired it was anymore. It was only after it got dark that he went home and curled up on the couch next to his mother. When morning came, he got up on his own, dressed and had cereal, then walked to school. Just like every other day now, he couldn't really hear what was being said by almost anyone. This time, grief was a barrier too, not just being their outsider. Considering it was their first day back since All Might's death, the teacher just decided to ease them back into the swing of things. However, when their break time came, things did not stay so relaxed. Two sets of little arms grabbed Izuku and started dragging him, and before he knew it he was behind the shed and staring down Bakugo. Quivering shoulders, bared teeth and piercingly furious red eyes that burned holes into Izuku's face, Kaken looked demonic. His voice wasn't any different. "It was your fault." Izuku blinked. "Huh?" Bakugo snarled, "It was because of you." Tears pushed themselves out of his eyes, little explosions popping in his palms. "You're the reason All Might died." His jaw dropped, eyes fluttering and going wide as his heart cracked. "And no. That's not Dash." "Shut up." Bakugo's fist flew like an arrow, hitting his face almost as hard. "If he didn't have to protect you, then he would have won and been fine. Shut up and take your punishment, you stupid, worthless Deku." With every punch and blast of Bakugo's quirk, a cold desperation pooled in Izuku's chest. Pain in his ribs, face and jaw, the other two boys gripping his arms so hard he'd almost certainly have bruises. Stars flashed in front of his eyes, blood dripping from his lips and nose. Bakugo only hit him harder, used his quirk more and more. Izuku's clothes were burned, his flesh singed and charred and his hair smoldered. Electricity moved through his body like ice through his veins, wondering if Bakugo was going to kill him. The harder he hit, the louder the explosions, the more that seemed to be likely. Struggling to get away, finding it to be a useless gesture, desperation began to claw at Izuku's brain, black and red began to fill his eyes. He had to do something, had to fight back. But how could he? He didn't have a quirk or the strength to do that. Why don't I have a quirk? Why is life? Bakugo pulled his fist back again, roaring like a lion as he went for the killing blow. Die. So unfair. Then maybe, you should make it more fair. A flash of black, a shockwave pulsing outward and all four boys went flying in different directions. Izuku was left lying on his back, Bakugo's stooges groaning as they rolled weakly on the ground. Red sparks flickered between Izuku and the other two boys, but not between him and Bakugo, before winking out of existence. Groggily, with the worst headache of his life, Izuku forced himself to sit up. Sitting up as well, Bakugo blinked. What just happened? One boy sniffled, his eyes shining with water pooling in them. I don't. Then he started sobbing into his palms. When the other boy did too, Bakugo snarled at them. What the hell? Why are you babies crying? Neither of them could answer, far too busy being overcome with emotion. Not one to waste an opportunity, Izuku took this as his moment to flee for his life. Bakugo was screaming for him to come back, raving, but Izuku was done listening to him. Red sneakers skidded and scuffed along the ground as he ran, no concept of time in his mind. Heartbeat hammering away, cold sweat on his skin, he fled without thinking about the destination. Eventually, chest heaving as he leaned against a wall to stay upright, he finally felt calm enough to stop. My fault. A fist clenched. No, that made no sense. All Might hadn't even known he was there, neither had the villain. Izuku wasn't the reason their hero was dead, he couldn't be. All the same, palms to his eyes, he started sobbing. He just stood there, against the wall and crying, for the longest time. Then, as he slowly quieted, he still heard someone sobbing uncontrollably. Sniffling, Izuku looked up and tried to find the source of that voice. Wiping at his nose and eyes, Izuku cautiously wandered over across the street to a crouched person. The person he could hear was just another boy with shaggy ice blue hair and the rattiest hoodie, jeans, and sneakers he'd ever seen anyone wear. When he looked up, with his bloodshot and glassy eyes, he saw a mole just under the right corner of his lips. He couldn't be much older than Izuku, just a couple of years at most. "Who are you?" Izuku said, kneeling beside him. Reddish-brown eyes stared into Izuku's green ones, searching for something like a frightened cat. Not seeing anything alarming, the other boy murmured, as he relaxed. He wiped at his face with a hand stained by old, dry blood. The lack of visible injuries on his skin somewhat telling. Tenko. He spoke with a small voice, pitiful enough that Izuku couldn't help but feel sorry for him. "My name is Tenko." Smiling, the green-haired boy offered him a hand. "I'm Izuku." Cautiously, a hand reached out and grasped his, and Izuku thought it strange that the other boy was making sure to leave his pinky far away from Izuku's skin. "Nice to meet you." After shaking his hand, Izuku shuffled around and sat next to him. "So, why are you crying?" Looking the other boy over again, he saw no small amount of dust covering his clothes. Blood stained the fabric and his skin in a few places, and there were bruises just beneath his collar. "Did someone hurt you too?" Thinking about this for a moment, Tenko nodded. "Yeah." His hands balled up, tightly, so much so his knuckles went white. Not knowing what else to say, Izuku went with his feelings. "Can I help?" Tenko shook his head. "It doesn't matter anymore." Standing up, sniffling and wiping at his face some more to clear the tears, he sighed. "That questline is cut, can't be completed without the NPCs anymore." Izuku stood up too, not quite getting what Tenko was talking about. "Are you sure?" "Yeah." Tenko looked Izuku up and down. "What about you? Who messed you up?" Laughing nervously, Izuku mumbled. "My friend Kaken, his name is really Katsuki Baku - no he's not." Izuku blinked. "Huh?" Tenko was glaring off to the side. "If someone hurts you that badly?" He pointed at the various cuts, bruises and burns on Izuku's skin and clothes. "They're not your friend. They're a villain. A jerk, an enemy worth only farming XP from." Scratching the back of his head, Izuku gave a lopsided frown. "What's XP?" The brunette sighed. "Just, he's not your friend, okay? Friends don't hurt each other without saying sorry." Feeling his heart sink, hugging himself and staring at the floor, his next words weren't even really a squeak. He wanted to argue, really he did. He wanted to fight tooth and nail for Kaken given how they'd grown up together, how close his mother was with Kaken's parents. But with a horrible sinking realization, he knew he couldn't deny the truth in Tenko's blunt words. Oh. Reaching forward with a closed fist, Tenko offered a small smile. But I'll be your friend. Immediately, Izuku's face warmed, and he felt the happiness inside him rise. Really? He paused as Tenko nodded, still smiling. Even though I'm quirkless. With a shrug, Tenko replied. Just less chance of you using a dumb quirk to hurt people with. Trust me, you're kind of lucky. Looking at Tenko's fist, just waiting there, Izuku reached out and did the one thing that made sense. He made his own fist and tapped his knuckles against those of the other boy. Yeah, maybe I am lucky. He smiled at the other boy, the one who had shown him more kindness in moments than Kaken had in years. But not because of that. Snickering, Tenko put his hands in his pockets. Lame. Taken aback, Izuku's face flickered with shock, confusion and then indignity. Now Tenko was laughing. Yeah, a little. As Izuku pouted, his grin became sincere. Thanks for cheering me up. Now it was the green-eyed boy's turn to smile. You too, Tenko. Seeing that the sun was setting, Izuku decided he'd better get going home. They said their goodbyes and went in different directions. Izuku would go home to a sobbing mother, worried sick about him leaving school like that, and would go to bed feeling terribly guilty. But he had made a friend. Feeling his heart sink, hugging himself and staring at the floor, his next words weren't even really a squeak. He wanted to argue, really he did. He wanted to fight tooth and nail for Kaken given how they'd grown up together, how close his mother was with Kaken's parents. But with a horrible sinking realization, he knew he couldn't deny the truth in Tenko's blunt words. Oh. Reaching forward with a closed fist, Tenko offered a small smile. But I'll be your friend. Immediately, Izuku's face warmed, and he felt the happiness inside him rise. Really? He paused as Tenko nodded, still smiling. Even though I'm quirkless. With a shrug, Tenko replied. Just less chance of you using a dumb quirk to hurt people with. Trust me, you're kind of lucky. Looking at Tenko's fist, just waiting there, Izuku reached out and did the one thing that made sense. He made his own fist and tapped his knuckles against those of the other boy. Yeah, maybe I am lucky. He smiled at the other boy, the one who had shown him more kindness in moments than Kaken had in years. But not because of that. Snickering, Tenko put his hands in his pockets. Lame. Taken aback, Izuku's face flickered with shock, confusion and then indignity. Now Tenko was laughing. Yeah, a little. As Izuku pouted, his grin became sincere. Thanks for cheering me up. Now it was the green-eyed boy's turn to smile. You too, Tenko. Seeing that the sun was setting, Izuku decided he'd better get going home. They said their goodbyes and went in different directions. Izuku would go home to a sobbing mother, worried sick about him leaving school like that, and would go to bed feeling terribly guilty. But he had made a friend. At school, the next day, Izuku would be met with an apologetic teacher and two very depressed students who didn't so much as nod all day. Bakugo's friends were very torn about something, but no one could make them say. When lunch break came, they just sat there, watching the other children play with their quirks in stone-cold silence. All the yelling, screaming and goading in the world from Bakugo wouldn't make them move. They just stared with eyes full of cold, mindless envy at their classmates while Izuku sat at a table and drew in his notebook. He didn't know why their eyes widened when they looked at him, or why Bakugo's eyes wouldn't meet his. You don't know what you did, do you? He had no idea why he'd asked himself that, but he didn't know, that much was true. When school ended for the day, Izuku would wander home and find the biggest surprise of the day. Tenko was waiting for him on the front steps, talking to his mother. It was the happiest he'd seen her in a month. "Welcome home, little Izu." She bounced to her feet and picked him up, hugging him close. Laughing up a storm, Izuku hugged her back. "Thanks, Mom." Petting his little head and kissing his cheek, she plopped him back down on his own 2 feet. "When were you going to tell me you made a friend?" Bashfully, Izuku scratched the back of his head. Well. We just met yesterday." Tenko explained. "I was all sad and junk, but he cheered me up." Inko turned and gave her boy a smile, eyes twinkling with pride. "Well, of course he did." Izuku blushed, but still turned to look at Tenko. "How did you find out where we lived?" He giggled. "You stalker." Tenko's eye twitched. "Damn brat. I asked one of your classmates how to get here. I had some games I wanted to show off to you." Inko ushered them inside. "Well then, who am I to get in the way of you playing? Come on you two, dinner will be ready soon before you play, and I think." "Tenko." The blue-annette nodded. "You can put that bag down in the living room. It looks quite heavy." Grabbing the strap on his shoulder, the older boy adjusted his backpack. "Yeah, it's all my games as well as my gaming console, crap." At the touch of all 5 fingers, the strap turned to dust and the backpack dropped. Only by leaping forward, his palms outstretched and snagging under the falling bag, did Izuku save the precious cargo. His stomach hit the ground and the wind was immediately knocked out of him, stars in his eyes as his wounds from yesterday ached. "Izuku." Inko leapt to his side. "Are you hurt?" She pulled him up and dusted him off, checking him over for any sign of further injury. Embarrassed, Izuku shook his head. I am okay, Mom, really." Making sure not to touch it with all his fingers this time, Tenko picked up the backpack with a timid, sullen expression. "Sorry." Izuku shook his head. "Don't worry about it." Grinning, he gave a thumbs up. "Is everything okay?" Unzipping the back, he looked everything over. "Yeah, looks fine." Zipping it back up, he shyly nodded. "Thanks for the save, can't exploit and clone this stuff if it breaks." Both Midoriyas blinked. "What?" Feeling self-conscious, Tenko slung the bag over his shoulder. "Nothing, never mind." With that they went inside, and Izuku noticed how Tenko was doing his best not to touch anything with all of his fingers. "So, your quirk turns stuff to dust when you touch with all your fingers at once?" Sighing, putting the backpack down, Tenko nodded. "Yeah, it's awful. I have no other way to control it either." After some thought, a light bulb might as well have gone off over Izuku's head. "I've got it." Running to the closet, he rummaged around until he found some simple, fabric mesh gloves. Running and grabbing some scissors from his room, he cut off all but the middle 2 fingers. Then he turned them inside out, and put some electrical tape around the inside of the remaining fingertips and set them right again. "Here." He offered the gloves to Tenko, smiling brightly. "Try them." Skeptically, Tenko reached out and accepted them, carefully putting them on. When he made a fist and nothing happened, his face lit up with the biggest smile his face could make. "You're a genius." He jumped forward and hugged Izuku, both of them laughing up a storm. When dinner came, they all sat around a table and ate katsudon together, chatting about various things that held no real meaning. Laughter, food and pleasant company helped all 3 forget the world outside. Afterwards, the boys helped her clean up and then set up to play the games Tenko brought over while Inko read a book, occasionally looking up and asking them about what they were playing. It was just some old role-playing game back from when Inko was a little girl, one of the few cooperative games in the collection that Tenko had somehow packed into his bag. For a moment or two, Tenko looked like he wanted to play one of the fighting games, squaring off against Izuku one-on-one, but decided otherwise. Nothing ruins a friendship like a good competition, so the old saying goes. When the sun finally started setting, Tenko packed up his games and went home, giving them both a hug goodbye before he left. Both of the Midoriyas could clearly see the change in his personality. Whereas the older boy had slouched when he first arrived at their home, and hung back from everything with some uncertainty, he seemed to almost have a spring in his step. Almost. Patting her son's shoulder, Inko gave him an affectionate squeeze. "I think giving him those gloves was wonderful idea, little Izu." "Why's that?" Inko pulled him back into the house, locking up for the night. "Did you see how happy he was?" Izuku nodded and she giggled. "Well, I think you made a lifelong friend today." He almost exploded with excitement. "You think so?" Shrugging, smiling coyly, Inko did her best not to answer too directly. "Maybe. We'll just have to wait and see, won't we?" Humming happily, Izuku nodded. "Guess so." His teeth brushed and his face washed, Izuku kissed his mother goodnight and headed up to bed. His room was still full of All Might figurines and posters, special edition action figures lining every available shelf space, but the den of a young boy's dreams had become something far more forlorn, a shrine to an age that once was. He wouldn't dare get rid of them, even with the memories they gave him. As he drew the covers up around him and drifted off, he blinked away one tear, but not one of sadness. This was one of hope. A lifelong friend. Maybe his mother would be right. Wouldn't that be nice? And that's it for today, guys. If you liked, please leave a comment and subscribe. It's my first time doing a text-to-speech what if, so I'm taking any advice. With that being said, see you all next time.